So last week we kind of did an introduction basically to the course as a whole, and to the structure and so on. And we also looked at the kind of an introductory area. It was basically about the structure, the typical legal structures that exist for businesses. So we spent some time talking about sole traders, then we talked about partnerships, then we talked about limited companies, and then within that we discussed a little bit the area of commercial versus non-commercial versus charity versus state and so on. So that was pretty much where we got to last week. So the next couple of rounds that we'll be covering in this area will this area will kind of bridge. It's about what's sometimes referred to as stakeholder theory, the recognition that there's a difference in a corporate context and particularly in a commercial company between the people that own the company and the people that run the company. Okay, and it's usually referred to as stakeholder theory, and then we'll be moving on to things like economics and so on. So, economics you'll be really excited about. You'll be looking forward to it no way. So these again, they're up online. These slides are up on Moodle, so you can grab them at any stage. So as I was saying, the has been a developing area kind of since the 80s on. Okay, so I know you guys were probably born in the 80s, if not the 90s. I had the Don Johnson jacket, the whole 9 yards. Did you ever watch the actual original Miami Vice? No? Yeah, I was all in. I even had the ponytail at the back and the whole 9 yards. I was in. There you go. But one of the things started to move away from the concept of companies solely and exclusively being responsible just to their shareholders and only for shareholder wealth. I mean, maximizing shareholder return is still really important. It's still the most. It's the first duty of the directors of a company. But over the last number of years, partly if for no other reason because there's been a load of corporate scandals, there's been a move away from saying, well, all companies need to worry about is their own shareholders, to there being more of a stakeholder concept that companies have to interact with people that work for them on the one hand and everyone else in the world on the other, and they should in some way, shape or form take account of that. And so you can see that even developing further at the moment. We'll be talking about it in one of the later lessons, corporate social responsibility. Have you heard that term? So we're now at the stage where we're not that far off of companies. They're not compelled to do it yet, but a lot of larger companies actually include what are called CSO reports, corporate social responsibility reports, in their annual accounts now. Now, it's not audited. You know, it may be real or it could be a load of stock photos taken from somewhere, but if that is the case, somebody will get caught out in that sooner or later. But there is definitely a push towards actually making that an integral part of financial reporting. So as well as just reporting the numbers, you report on lots of things around how you treat your staff, how you treat the places that you draw resources from, and so on, because that's just becoming something that's more and more important, especially with globalization. Okay, so the kinds of things we'll be talking about in this context is the definition of what constitutes a stakeholder, and I mean, it's really kind of simple. Pretty much anyone that has an interest is really a stakeholder, and so that is absolutely the shareholders. It's also management, it's also staff, and it's also a whole range of other people, all of whom have different levels of interest in the firm. Obviously, what follows on from that is the idea is that there's probably internal and external stakeholders. So there's people that are internal to the company, and then there's people or organizations that are external. And so obviously there's a difference between those two in terms of, for a start, the amount of information you can give them. So you can't give them your monthly management reports or your board. Every board minute immediately is not going out to, the Greenpeace if they're worried about what you do. Does that make sense to everyone? So there's an element of managing that as well. They obviously are going to have different objectives, and they also have different power. Okay, so if you were to, for example, identify the government as one stakeholder, in your business, or in relation to your business. Clearly, they have quite a lot of power. Worst case scenario, they can shut you down. So government can say in lots of situations, oh, you're not running this properly, or you've done something wrong, or you need to have this license, or you need to make sure you pay your tax on time, and so on. And on the other hand, one person on their own, up the road somewhere, is unlikely to have a lot of power, in terms of being a stakeholder. They're still a stakeholder, but one ordinary member of the public that lives, around the corner from here, has no real direct influence as a stakeholder on the Coca-Cola company. Or to put it another way, I have no direct influence other than being a customer in that scenario. Does that make sense to everyone? So that's what we'll be exploring. So in terms of where this, falls into, in your book, this all comes under chapter 5. And as I said already, everything that's in the slides here relates directly to a chapter in your book. I may not have written the chapter down in each set of slides, although I might actually sit down and do that. I was thinking about that today. But just by reading the headings, you should be able to see, because they do tie in directly. Okay, so stakeholders. So, at the core, we're looking at an organization. Generally, this stuff we talk about a company. And theoretically, it doesn't have to be a company. It could be a charity. It could be it could be a government body. But for the purposes of this exercise, we're going to look at it as if we're looking at a commercial company. Okay, and for that, you have a group of stakeholders, different people that are involved. So if you look at it, we can start anywhere. We might as well start with the obvious one, which is the owners. Okay, so the owners of a company are the shareholders, and the straightforward question for that group and all the other groups is, what are they interested in? Okay, so if I'm a shareholder, if I'm the owner of a company or part owner, as a shareholder is, what am I interested in relation to the company? Profit. So I want to know, if I've invested money, am I getting a return on that? And that return is represented by profit. Okay, absolutely. Anything else I might be interested in? Banking? Ranking. Yeah. So how well is the company? So exactly, I might be interested in investing in a company, not just because I've necessarily looked at. I'm sure there are lots of people who've bought Apple shares because it's Apple, like everything else. No offense, actually, I'm talking to the mic myself. Do you see that? No offense, Steve Jobs. But there, you absolutely do have that. You have companies that want to appear in a certain way, and people like to invest in them as well. And also, actually, when you go into a lot further in that, so with investment, there are a portion of professional investors in particular that only, for example, invest in the top 100 companies in the stock exchange. And so if your ranking is below that, they'll all get out of that investment. And so, merely sometimes by the fact the company moves into the top 100, it can actually become even more valuable, because all of these professionals will actually go and buy the shares so that their portfolio has that portion of shares in it. So ranking is absolutely right. Other things they might be interested in, how the management, how the directors that they've appointed are actually running the company. So, the ultimate power usually in a company is actually the annual general meeting. Although you can kind of put a big caveat on that, given that it usually only happens once a year, and there's one set of decisions that are taken. But if a group of shareholders really wants to, there's lots of stuff they can do. They usually don't, because they've appointed a board to run the company on their behalf. Does that make sense? But worst case scenario, if enough shareholders put their heads together, they can actually hold what's called an extraordinary general meeting, with the view to throwing all the directors out if they want to. And that does happen very occasionally. Happened here about 2 years ago. There's a company, now it's a bit of a disaster at this stage, called Conroy Resources. It was set up by Professor Richard Conroy, who was kind of gold exploration and mineral exploration. But they haven't made any money for years, despite having a stock exchange listing. They basically made enough money to pay the directors' fees. That's about it. And so the shareholders finally got annoyed about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and threw the lot of them out, lock, stock, and barrel. And so now we're in the situation where the Richard Conroy, the guy who formed Conroy Resources, no longer has a job with Conroy Resources. That's what can happen.
You know when you're talking about shareholders themselves and like board members and stuff like that, is that like you know when you have a CEO or a general executive, like do they all does that person outrank
No, so the
the board the decisions, or
no,
is
so
it
the
still the
shareholders
owners?
are ultimately the power, but they don't wield it that often because they don't. It's a bit like the same way as a voter, you elect the government, but you don't go in and tell the government what to do every day. And so the people then that control it are the board of directors. So the board, and that board then will usually hire the CEO, um, and so often the boards is a mix of there may be some executives on it, and although it's considered bad practice, you do still see boards where the chief executive sits on the board. But for when we talk about corporate governance later on, that's considered bad corporate governance. And so there's an aim to separate the executive role from the board role. But the board then is the overarching responsible group. But then, like a bit like the shareholders, they also don't necessarily involve themselves in everything to do with the day to day running. They're much more focused on strategy and overall profitability, and they hire a management team in turn. And that's the C people, CEO, CFO, COO, whatever C's. Everyone is trying to get in that C role now. So there's a whole load of new ones in the last. So the chief operating officer, that's been around for a while. There's now the CTO, chief technical officer. IT are trying to muscle in on it.
I think it's CFO, isn't it? For
It
finance,
yeah,
or
it was the
CIO.
finance, and then they're starting to push for a chief risk officer.
You already have one.
Have you got
Two
one?
of them
Yeah,
actually.
and so they're pushing this out. So there'll be all of these C roles all of a sudden, that are popping up all over the place. So those are the owners. What would the banks be interested in? Exactly. So if they've given them a loan, they want to be paid. If there's been guarantees given, those guarantees can stand up, and so on. The main thing a bank wants to know is that it's going to get paid. Okay. Absolutely. Who's next? The government. There's a couple of things they might be interested in. Overarching one is probably what's the government always interested in? They take it out of your salary every week or month.
Tax.
Tax. Okay, so first and foremost, the government needs to know that it's going to have a certain level of tax coming in, and you may think that that's oh, oh dear. Now I am going to have to edit it. Um, you might think that there is kind of I just get this now. It's basically not a major issue. There was a time in this country during the 80s where the government pretty much the, the only people paying any considerable amounts of tax were down in what was called the Shannon Free area, which was like a free port down in Shannon Airport on the west coast. And there still technically is this idea of a free port, and the government actually used to send somebody specially to collect a check from them, literally because that was where that was the only money that was coming in at any stage. So worst case scenario, you want to know what your taxes are, and I mean there is a formal process in the Department of Finance to monitor how much comes in every month, and so on. So you have the tax side of things. What else is there then? Do you think on a government side?
That they're like as you were saying, CSO, or that they're a socially responsible
Exactly, exactly.
organization.
So compliance, they're not coming in and wrecking the country. They're not, doing things that can cause problems for the country. And so, if they're in a more regulated industry like banking or something like that, are they complying with their requirements there? And so, I mean, the central bank, you could argue, didn't do a lot during the crisis starting in '07, but it's gone from kind of I think that there was about 500 people working in it at that stage. It's almost 2,000 people working in the central bank now. So they've beefed up all of those areas significantly. You may argue too little, too yet late, and indeed you may be absolutely right on that one. But better late than never. So you have that, and I mean, things can go wrong if business is left to its own devices. Stuff can go wrong and stay going wrong. when I it came up again in something recently. Look it up if you get a chance. A coal mine in somewhere in Pennsylvania under a town accidentally caught fire during the 60s and is still burning today.
It's like the Amazon rainforest the last 3 years.
Say that's the kind of thing it's going on
But
as well.
still burning, yeah.
It's still burning. This has been burning since the 60s or the 70s. They've actually had to just take away the whole town because it's just, there's just kind of um, gases seeping up from the underneath the ground, and so let people run their own thing. Don't mind it properly, and you can end up with you know bad situations. So regulation is part of what government does. So as a stakeholder there and there. What about customers?
I suppose you'd be looking for like making sure that it's regulated in the sense that they're selling to the right target market,
Yeah,
so that you're not selling unsuitable products, etc.
yeah. So you might be interested in making sure that the product is safe. Okay, so um, for example, in the case of medicines, or foodstuffs, you want to be sure that they're coming from a source that you're happy with. Um, in terms of what about in a business to business context? So what if I was a business customer and you were supplying me with my raw materials to manufacture these tables? What would I want to know about you in that situation?
Quality, where the raw materials are coming
Quality,
from.
yeah, even more basic than that. Will you be around? Okay, so I'm partly basing my business on the fact that I'm buying this stuff from you. Maybe there's loads of highly competitive sellers out there, and so I don't need to worry too much about you going out of business. But on the other hand, if there's only one or two, then I need to worry very seriously about you going out of business. Because if you go out of business, then I have no source for my raw material. So I might be worried that if I take somebody on, um, as my supplier, that supplier is able to provide the service over the period reasonably that I want it. Does that make sense? So you can actually see that quite a lot nowadays, where um, uh, particularly in larger contracts, that's part of it. The place you can see it most often, because it has to be done in public, is actually in government tender contracts. Part of their requirement now is that the provider supplies proof that they are financially viable, so that you don't just, not to say it never happens, but to try and reduce the chance that the supplier will go out of business mid provision. It does happen. It can be bad. So there's a firm called Carillion, or was a firm called Carillion. They were a big kind of infrastructure builder, started in the UK. They had about 12 or 14 school contracts to build or upgrade schools around here, and they went out of business again approximately a year and a half ago. And just went, okay, yeah, somebody has to finish it, but it's not us because we're gone. You know. So if you can detect that, you really should be looking out for it. What about society at large? What do we care about? Yeah, so we're interested in the reputation of the company. We're interested in the effect they might be having on us. Okay, um, if you think about things even like environmental issues, so obviously the level of these things can change depending on the world, where in the world you are in terms of how regulated they are. I mean, there's reports of, for example, it's a good few years ago now, but I think it was being shipped out of France ultimately. Nuclear waste was basically being put on ships, in containers, and just literally offloaded into ports in Senegal and just left sitting on the side of the docks in Senegal. And I know in the last 6 months even, a lot of the recycling, the stuff that was being taken in for recycling was actually being shipped over to China, and the Chinese have started to have started to refuse to take that, and so the boats are being turned around, and so all of these things have an impact in terms of long term. Could be that, could just be noise issues. If it's somewhere, my mother's from a town down the country called Carrick and Shore, and they had this factory that basically almost everyone worked in called the tannery. It was basically where the place that leather was made, but there was two problems with it. Well, not problem, but one, the smell out of it would knock a horse. Okay, so the town was constantly stinking, and the second thing was every morning, and during the day and the evening, a hooter went off, and because it was pretty much the main employer in the town, you could hear the hooter the whole way off over the town, calling people into work every morning. So they were in that case they were all bought in. It shows what they thought of it. It was like basically get up, and it was like but literally you could hear it kind of in a 2 mile radius of the factory. You could hear this hooter going off. Now my grandmother lived about 200 meters from it, so it was like every morning you're on your holidays and you're drive you mad. Anyway, so society's interested in lots of different things as well. And I suppose it's also worth bearing in mind, we talked about, particularly in terms of companies, society grants companies limited liability. So, in other words, the right that the shareholders won't be pursued for the debts of the companies in a lot of circumstances. And so, as a quid pro quo, they also like to know some information about the company. That makes sense to everyone? Okay. Suppliers, what do suppliers want to know? Yeah, exactly. So if I supply you with something, my main concern is I don't really care what you're going to do with it. However, I care whether you're going to pay me for the supply of that item. And so I want to pay attention to that. Employees, what are they interested in?
Are they going to get paid?
Yeah, first and foremost, are they going to get paid? Okay, so will they get paid? Then you move on from that. You can almost go a Maslow's hierarchy of needs if you've ever talked about that before. So once you got paid, then am I working with nice people? Might be a concern. Is it a fulfilling job up at the top end if you can get to that level of it? And so employees are interested in all of those things as well. And then finally, your competitors. Why might they be interested in what you're doing?
They want to do it better.
Yeah. So by definition, exactly, you're in competition. So they want to know things like how are you competing? How do you compete on price? Do you appear to be more profitable than we are? And if so, why? You know. And so there's lots of issues in there as well. And normally we talk about two types of stakeholders. We talk about internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. And as the ad says, it does exactly what it says on the tin. Okay, so in other words, internal stakeholders are basically people who work inside in the organization, and realistically, that's two major groups. It's the employees and it's the management. Okay, and so the employees obviously are interested in things like salaries, conditions, job security, etc. And the management also may be interested in a lot of those things, but also may be interested in status, bonuses, and ultimate success in that scenario. Does that make sense to everyone? So there's very similar types of relationships between, in terms of the overall interest, but they're important stakeholders for the obvious reason that they can do an awful lot of damage if they're not happy. Does that make sense? So, employees in the worst case scenario can go on strike, or can even engage in what would you call it? Just bad work. During one of the problems I think for the U.S. car industry in the 80s, 90s, and beyond was they built loads of cars, but the quality was so bad, like they were awful, and that even Americans didn't want to buy American cars because you bought your car and half the things were rattling. The buttons for the turning the windows up and down fell off immediately. None of the panels were attached properly. I mean, it was so bad that they actually brought in special legislation. It's called the Lemon Law, because they used to refer, I don't know why, but they referred to buying a dud like that, dud car, as buying a lemon. And so they brought in lemon laws. It was so prevalent in the American car industry, you know. And so, employees could do a lot of damage if they want to. And I mean, look, they have to be managed. There's things that happen as well, particularly if you think about and we will talk about this in later chapters. But you think about the sometimes informal things that can arise with employees as well if you're not careful. You know, you may have no formal, minimum amount or maximum amount that somebody should do in a week. But I've worked in several jobs over the years where people try to say, oh, no one should do more than 25 in a week. 25 is plenty for everybody. That wasn't management saying that. It was you know what I mean? There was somebody in there who says, well, Jesus, I don't want to work too hard. So, but I don't want to look bad. And so I'm going to get everyone else to be equally as unproductive as I am. And I've said not just once. I've worked in places that several times. And in fact, one was because I would ignore them. But I remember in one, the person who was trying to push that all actually went and took some of the work that I did off a shelf, brought it over to me, and told me I'd done too much. Put that in your drawer for next week. So the work was already done, but they didn't want me to submit it that week. They wanted me to hold it until the next week. Absolute madness. But those things build up. You know, that's not. Oh God, I could go on for hours about it. I worked in Irish Rail for a while as well. Did I mention that last week? First job I ever had, cleaning trains in Irish Rail. And then we did apps. Oh my God, I'll throw a few stories in at different stages, but all the informal stuff, the stuff that there might have been rules on, but that just went on in there, whereby you know um, yeah, anyway, don't get me started. We could go on that for hours. And again, with management, and the danger with management is that they can be motivated by their own things as well. And the most obvious one um, is management can be motivated by their own status rather than the good of the company. Okay, so what they might really care is how big am I? I mean, if you want to see the worst case of that, you could argue that looking at what Trump tried to do by buying Iceland as an example, or by buying Greenland as an example of that. I mean, I think a part of it at least had to be that he wanted to buy enough territory so that the US was the largest country in the world by land area. And so he says, I'll buy Greenland. Oh, I mean, it got worse. You saw what happened afterwards. Like the Danish prime minister, Greenland is a Danish. Not exactly how it works. It's not Denmark, but it's part of Denmark, if that makes sense. I think they have a queen in Denmark, and the queen of Denmark is the queen of Greenland, and there's a couple of other things like that. So it would be you'd think for Denmark, but the prime minister of Denmark said this is nuts, and so Trump was supposed to go and visit in 2 weeks' time. He said, "For talking to me like that, I'm not going." He's a man child, but like that's the real thing in his head is well, if I could buy Greenland, then the US would be a bigger country by landmass, or would be getting close to being the biggest country by landmass on the planet. And that's all he's thinking. Anyway, look, it's going to end horribly. Practice everything. Hide under the desk. The zombie apocalypse is coming. Okay, so external. You can break external down under a couple of headings as well. So you can talk about them in terms of being connected but external. Okay, so shareholders are generally considered to be external stakeholders. So they're not employees, they're not management, they're not in the company on a day-to-day basis, but at the same time they're very closely connected to the company because they are the ultimate owners, and they have and can wield a lot of power in relation to the company. So they're going to be interested in, as we said, a number of things, including capital growth, which just means the growth of the value of their shares, dividends, survival, and success. Customers just want to get what they need, and that they're going to continue that to receive whatever it is they need to get from them. Again, doesn't matter if we're talking about a corner shop, okay, in the city centre. Doesn't really matter if I can't buy something in a newsagent there, I can probably buy something in a newsagent over there. But think about medical supplies in this country. I think the stockists in pharmacies and chemists. I think there's only 2 firms in the country that do that work directly, that import the stuff and ship it on and everything. So you don't even want one of them to go out of business. Do you know what I mean? If you think about it, because well, they're not. I mean, by definition, it is actually between it is a very profitable industry, so there's no chance as it stands of them going out of business. But if you think about it, if there's only two of them, you know, and they may start, what they certainly may start to have now is they may find themselves in difficulty actually getting supplies because everyone is stockpiling in advance of Brexit in October, and I was in yesterday collecting prescription for my daughter, and the person in front of me had looked. The prescription was for a month's in tablets, and whatever tablet they were on, they would only give them 14 of them because there wasn't enough of a supply. Come back next week um, to get the rest of them. So it's having an impact, and so worst case scenario, if I'm a manufacturer then and I use there's lots of different types of chemicals that come from one very small group of suppliers, and if they don't supply it to me, then I'm in serious trouble. Suppliers getting paid in survival, and then financiers, they want to be paid, and they'd also be interested in security as well. So if the firm they're thinking of giving a loan to has lots of assets that are not encumbered by attached loans, they'll be very happy to loan money to them. So if they own 14 different buildings spread all over Europe, and they're willing to put those buildings up as a guarantee, as security for a loan, usually the banks are very happy with that because they can just take the buildings and sell them if it doesn't work out. Then fully external, people that don't have a direct commercial relationship with the firm. That includes the community and society at large. So we talked about them already. They care about ultimately they care about directly their own situation. And we're never too far in this country, and I'm sure it's not that different anywhere else, from a insert your town or village here says no to insert whatever the latest proposal is here. Okay, so the current one all over Dublin, I don't know if you've seen it, is communities not bus corridors. You've seen our communities not corridors. Okay, so and there's always something like that. So the first big one I remember was the telephone masts, the mobile phone masts. Everyone wanted the mobile phones to work, but they just didn't want to be anywhere near the mobile phone mast. And so every community up and down the country had X says no to masts, and so that ran for a few years. Nobody seemed to realize the nature of radio waves is such that they lose power very quickly the further they are from the mast. And so even though there's a mast, if you look over to your right, you will see a big mast with loads of stuff on it. There's far more power coming directly out of the phone than there is hitting you from that mast over there because the power drops off really quickly. Does that make sense to everyone? So the radio transmitter in the phone beside you is going to have far more of an impact. And in fact, you could argue, depending on how the software works in the phone, that if it is further away from a mast and finding it more difficult to connect, then it's going to probably try and push its power up or try and connect more regularly and actually pump out more radio waves the further it is from the mast. The latest one is somebody who's trying to do the same thing with respect to, I think Gemma O'Doherty is pushing a 5G is going to be evil. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that are, but I mean, when the campaign started around the mobile phone, there was no medical evidence that they had an impact, and there's still no medical evidence today that they have certainly a significant impact. I'm sure there's something, but again, far more radiation out of probably sitting in front of the TV even, sitting using a microwave than there would be from a phone mast. There's always a chance, depending on the frequency, if there's resonance, like what's called resonance. So your body starts to move at exactly the same rate as that's how microwaves work. So they shoot the waves in, and the water molecules start to vibrate and heat up, and that's how it actually heats things up. And so theoretically, if you hit the exact right frequency, that could happen, but there's no one saying that's the right frequency. So anyway, that's all by way of saying, there's lots of entities have lots of different interests, and they can cause quite significant impacts on companies. So there was a very long fought campaign over in Mayo against the shell gas. It's called a Corot gas field against the landing of the gas in a particular town on the coast in Mayo. And I mean, they fought an absolutely relentless campaign over a 10 to 15 year period, trying to prevent this thing from happening, you know. And so it's not just that you can sit back and say, nah, they can't have any impact on me. They cost Shell tens, if not hundreds of millions of euro. Certainly tens of millions, no question about that, if not hundreds of millions. Now, you may hate Shell and say, great, and that's absolutely your prerogative. But what I'm trying to say to you is, from a company's point of view, it's better if we manage this relationship rather than find ourselves with 70-year-old ex-school teachers standing in front of our diggers in West Mayo trying to and comparing themselves to human rights activists in Africa. So, you know, they kind of over egged it when they got to it by the end. But you know, it's still at the same time. I mean, that's just one example, and there's been lots of others. I don't know if any of you ever travel on the N11 or the M11 down into Wicklow and down to Wexford. So down along the coast south, there's a motorway. Um, that was blocked for years by a group of environmental activists who basically lived in trees. So it goes through just after you get out of kind of south of Bray, you end up going through a small kind of forested area, which I mean, you know, you don't want anyone destroying it because that's one of the few original forests that are left here. So it's an original ancient forest. It's not like, you know, the way we seem to have these spruce trees everywhere, the conifers, the Christmas tree type things everywhere. They're not native to this country at all. Our native things are the ones that are grown down in that valley. It's one of the few valleys in the that where it actually happened. So they weren't wrong, but ultimately it was built. But they spent 10 years living in trees, and not, that's not it's not a euphemism. They built little platforms in the trees, and they lived on those platforms to try and protect the trees. You know? So you have lots of that. They get good at it in the States. They got quite nasty, and that's what you have to look out for in the logging. To have a go against the logging, they started spiking trees. So the activists would drive long spikes or long nails into the trees, um, and the idea was that the chainsaw would hit the spike and it would break the chain. The problem with a fully spinning chainsaw is if you break the chain on it, it could very easily come back and just slice the head off of the person who's trying to cut the tree down. You know, so they weren't messing. And lots of look, there was a couple in the UK where, and this was in fairness, it was absolutely genius in one sense. They developed a system whereby they concreted handcuffs a into a kind of a thing that you could put your arm into, but not much else. And in the event there was a final raid on the site, a couple of people were tasked with going in, clamping into the what you call it, the handcuffs, and so you couldn't just take them away. So they had to spend whatever chopping away the concrete, and you know, the hope being they could rally and get back around for that. So you know, you have to manage these things. There's no point in thinking you can just turn up, do whatever you like, and then everyone's going to agree to it. So the community is serious. So are environmental pressure groups. You know, they have views. They, you know, believe in saving the planet, and whether you have views on global warming or not, and there's unfortunately some people out there who don't believe in it. It's generally a good idea not to dirty the place you live in. You know, as a basic concept, don't make a mess of the place you live on. So, you know, you can absolutely say, you know, they make lots of good points, but they're very active and they know how to campaign. And if you're pumping loads of stuff out into a river, or you're pumping out loads of chemicals onto fields or up into the sky, then sooner or later you're going to come across some of these guys, you know. And so the Japanese, for example, have started whaling again, and so they will have Greenpeace, and there's a Sea, I know Shepherd of the Sea, and Shepherd of the Sea are a very radical group, Apparently they tried to board, so whereas the Greenpeace would generally kind of sail around and just make life awkward, Sea Shepherd will try and jump on your boat and do stuff like that, you know. So, and they'll be sitting down in the in the Antarctic in -15, jumping on, trying to jump across onto other people's boats and all. So again, if you can prevent that, you're probably better off in the first place. Government, we talked about it. They like to see business success because it generates jobs, it generates taxes, but they also want to see companies and other businesses comply with the rules. And then trade unions are also going to be interested. So representing the workers, but not the actual workers. So in that sense, they're not an internal entity; they're an external entity, but they can well be participating in decision making and collective bargaining and representing workers. And in Ireland, there is a constitutional entitlement to organise a trade union. So you can't be, despite some American companies seem to be able to not have union organisation, you could not. It is illegal to prevent a union organising in a workplace in this country. So there you go. And then you have primary versus secondary stakeholders, and really that kind of is to do with contractual relationships versus other types of relationships. So the contractual relationship, like an employee or a supplier or a customer, there's a legal, direct legal relationship between the two parties. And for secondary, there's no legal relationship. So certainly there's no contractual relationship. So there's nothing there that says you should do what I'm asking you to do because we have an agreement that you should do it. So, you know, a contract at its core is just a legally enforceable agreement between two parties. That makes sense? Okay, a couple of other. You will do company law in due course, and you can't wait to do that. Sure, you can't company and business law. You look so excited about it. Yeah? No? Hey? No, it's actually, most people find it interesting in the end, as long as you don't get the dangerous lecturers in this one, you get them both in, sometimes in law and in auditing, where they literally sit and read the textbook out to you. So they would literally take the book and read it out. To which my answer would be, well, I can do that at home myself, you know. But as long as it's not that, I have what there's a guy. He's Moorish O'Cady is his name. I don't think he does any stuff here, but he does a lot of law lecture in different places, and he's also head of the Milk Marketing Board. But he treats it as storytelling. He teaches law as like he's a Shanachie. He's a storyteller. He sits there. Yeah, he sits there, and everything is by example, by story. You know, and he's brilliant. Absolutely.
I had on my technician.
You had him, had you? Yeah.
No, I had a completely different guy down in the country who did the same way.
Yeah, yeah.
It was just amazing.
Yeah, it's so like
interesting.
the causes of laws and the results, the causes of court cases are fascinating. The actual dry law is just as boring as, and so if you can bring the two together, and so in this, to give you one example, okay, so why is there a law? Why is there such a thing as a duty of care in law? Okay, so what is duty of care? Duty of care means if I run a shop, for example, somebody comes into my shop, then I can't just say you're coming in here on your own. Even if you put the sign up that says you are entering and it's your own responsibility, I have a responsibility for your safety while you come into my shop. So two, this is true. I'm just stealing this as one of the good stories. Two old ladies were sitting in a restaurant in the old Clearys. But now this is back at the turn of the last century, so back in early 1900s, I think. And they ordered two bottles of lemonade, and they had the lemonade. And when they were finishing off the lemonade, they found snails in the bottom of their bottles. And so they went to court arguing. You know, they said, Clearys, you have a duty to make sure when you serve us lemonade, that lemonade, as a bare minimum, is free from free from snails. Clearys denied it. Said no, we've no duty of care whatsoever. But that court case actually established the duty of care in that situation, as an example. So that's really interesting. But the fact of a duty of care, who cares? You know.
Do you know with I know this might be going back to different people intern.
Yeah, no problem.
Where do they fall stakeholder kind of hierarchy?
Sponsors in the concept in the
I
like.
suppose like a corporate sponsor.
Yes, it's an interesting one. They would be considered external. They would be similar in some ways to customers. They're people that provide you with a source of income. It depends on how interested they are after that. So, if it was RTE and you were sponsoring, I don't know, Love Island, um, or something like that, that's really is a commercial relationship. It's not much more than an advertising relationship. On the other hand, if you were to get sponsorship from somebody like Chuck Feeney's Atlantic Philanthropies, they would be very interested in what you do afterwards with it, and may even, in some circumstances, some of these people supplying this may actually say we want to put someone on the board, depending on how much they're putting on, and that would become much closer to being an internal relationship rather than an external relationship. But generally, it would be external. So even things like government, unless they require, something additional, would generally be external. But you could, in some circumstances, see a sponsor try to get involved. Does that answer?
Yeah, I think I was thinking more on like the Aviva Stadium.
Yes.
So they don't pick a sponsor stadium.
Yeah, it's
They
really
have
that.
a like indirect link to the FAI and stuff like
Yeah, they do, and I mean they would have some power within it because they obviously have given them naming rights and they expect minimum visibility and so on. But fundamentally, it's not that different to agreeing to put something on a hoarding around the pitch on match day. It's the same kind of arrangements that are in there, and it would just be that the kind of thing that they would have to protect would be the use of the name. Okay, so the one thing that the Aviva Stadium doesn't want to see people using is Lansdowne Road, so that was called Lansdowne Road Stadium for the best part of 150 years, and then Aviva arrived and said, "Hi, we'll sponsor it," and it's pretty much become the Aviva, and that's happened all over. That's happened all over the world. There's stadia have gone um, and named after companies, and I think in a couple of cases now long after the company has gone out of business. So the baseball, what they call theirs the World Series. The World Series wasn't actually doesn't actually mean the World Championship of baseball. It was some kind of a commercial thing that was done in the States when it was originally called that, but they bought indefinite sponsorship. So I think the company has gone out of business, but it's still called the World Series because they bought perpetual rights to the naming of the baseball series. Don't completely hold me to that, but I'm almost 99% sure that's actually correct. But that it's not actually, like the World Cup of baseball, the way everyone scoffs at it and says they're trying to say that, you know. And so you can have lots of conflicts then, and obviously, if there's no conflicts, there's nothing to worry about really or manage. But the problem is that within these relationships, conflicts can arise, and so the obvious one is something like conflict between management and staff, and so that can be about pay or conditions or bonuses or benefits. But it can be about anything, and it is so easy if you're not careful when you're trying to manage a group of people to get on the wrong side of them and end up in a conflict, and so Ryanair are in direct conflict with a number of pilots at the moment. Now they may be demanding a raise, and they may or may not be uh, wrong or right on that front, um, but that's not really the core of it because I think the average is 170,000 a year, a pilot salary. Um, but their actual issue is much more fundamental, um, and it's got to do with not so much with the money, but they're considered contractors. They're not employees. Most pilots of Ryanair are not employees, which is nuts. They technically they're self-employed contractors, which doesn't make sense, you know. Because if you're self-employed, you're supposed to be able to say where you're going to do your own work, aren't you? So imagine turning up and going to Michael O'Leary on a Monday morning and said, "Do you know what? It's a bit cold for me in Oslo this week. I'd like to fly down to Faro instead in Portugal." Doesn't happen, you know. and so they're getting pushed back on it, and so it probably got more to do with conditions than salaries. But there's, it's easy to get into conflict, and you have to be careful, and especially at the moment, I think there are there are not a lot of new trained pilots coming onto the market. So, kind of in the 90s, there was an awful lot of pilots, ex-military pilots, coming out of Eastern Europe. So as the Cold War ended, there was loads of of people who could fly, but that group was gone now, and so it's not as easy to just hire, and then loads of them are being hired over to the Middle East, over to the different airlines there, and Norwegian Air has been running flights all over the place as well. And so they're picking their time very well, of course, on this too. But you can get into all kinds of conflicts. You just don't know what the conflict is. Then there's customers versus shareholders. Okay, and there's a direct conflict there. Okay, so what do the shareholders want? They want to see as much profit as possible because that will add value to their shares. Customers don't want to see the shareholders getting as much profit as possible because they want to get as best a price as possible. And there's always a conflict between the two. You have to get a decent profit, but if it gets excessive, then the customers might eventually get upset. On the other hand, if you make no profit, then the shareholders get upset, and ultimately, if you don't make a profit, a company goes out of business. So there's always a balance, but there's also always a fight. Um, the Ultimate actually recently. Anyone Apple fans? Before I go any further, I quite like them. Okay, but this $1,000 stand for the new computer is insanity. So not the computer isn't $1,000. The stand to put the computer on is $1,000
They have a keyboard that's a similar price. The keyboard.
for the keyboard.
Yeah, it's not the new iPad keyboard.
Yeah.
The price is like 600 quid.
Ah, you're
And the
joking.
iPad is like 1,000.
Oh no,
So,
that's
yeah,
insanity.
they're trying to like justify it as like the Surface Pro that Microsoft launched, but it's obviously detachable. Yeah, it's about
So they're trying to say because Microsoft managed to get nearly, well, I mean the
$2
Surface
grand for the laptop.
is $2 grand. Well, then we should be able to charge you an extra 600, 700 for this. Oh, that's insanity. That's even worse.
Yeah,
That's
and
actually worse.
they actually made like the keyboard itself isn't compatible with normal iPad.
I know,
It's
I
like
heard
a
that.
new standard.
Yeah. So and that'll come. That time will come because Apple have done this before. They've gone off so much and relied on the unwavering loyalty of their customers.
But you even look at like they changed the ports on all their new phones, so you can't use like the normal headphone jack. You
Yeah,
have to buy the Apple
the
connector.
dongle. Yeah.
And one of their most one of the top selling items that they have is the little tiny jack, just because of how many people have to buy it.
It's mad. I mean, the only good thing is they've now switched to USB-C, which is although now and then they could do stuff to make it unique to themselves anyway. But yeah, so it's something. But yeah, it's. And don't get me wrong, you want to charge a tenner for it, I won't hate you for it. But a headphone jack is basically connecting internal wires to external wires. That's all it does. So, and if you do that with a USB cable, there are two audio wires in the cable, and it's just connecting those two audio wires in the jack onto it. It is not doing anything special, you know.
Remaining 100% profit.
Yeah, 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 literally nothing, you know. But if people are willing to pay it, great. But a pressure always comes, you know. You can only go so far. I think this round, I mean, it's very high end, but this round, the high end computers is all going to be 4 and 5 grand a pop, you know. And north of that, that's the entry level, you know. And after that, then you could be looking at, if you want to spend enough, you could be spending €10,000 without even blinking, you know. If it works out, it'll be, they'll be more profitable than Jesus. But the problem is they are more likely to eventually push it too far, you know. And they have form for that. That's what they did when they almost went out of business, you know. And who saved them from going out of business? Everyone tries to say it was Steve Jobs. It wasn't. Microsoft bought a share in Apple to keep them afloat. They bought a percentage of Apple to keep it afloat. Now, it was for entirely selfish reasons, but it was actually for them to protect themselves from the government. Going back to that, when we talked about, only two people in the market, so they were getting lashed at the time because they basically had the only browser, and were really the only major suppliers of operating systems, and so they mainly kept Apple afloat to protect them from an accusation that they had a monopoly, because they could point to Apple and say, well, Apple does all of this as well. There you go. Useless information, but interesting nonetheless. And so you can have the public versus the shareholders as well. And so the public can be very unhappy with shareholders getting returns ahead, while something is being done that's untoward within the company. If a bank is going in and repossessing tons of houses while at the same time rewarding their shareholders, generally the public eventually might get very upset about stuff like that. So long as they're repossessing the right houses, that's part. Nobody had an issue when there was a solicitor. I don't know if you remember it. It was almost celebrated. There was a solicitor out in, I think it was in Dalkey, called O'Donnell. I mean, the house was beautiful. It had a sea view on a hill, and it was a lovely thing. But the media spent days just waiting for them to come in and get him out of the house so they could film him being taken out. So everyone celebrated that, but in other ones they won't be as happy with it. And so you have all of these, and then obviously you can have the managers versus the shareholders, and this one is particularly important because this is what brought about a lot of what we call corporate governance now, which is the issue of the difference in responsibility between the shareholders and the managers. And so the idea is you appoint managers to operate on your behalf if you were the shareholder. So, in most companies those are called the directors or the board, or they may have other names, but roughly they're usually called that. But the problem is that once they're ensconced in their offices, they may not necessarily always be motivated by maximizing shareholder wealth. Okay, so for example, if you were the manager, you were in a huge conglomerate and you were responsible for the electricity supply division. Say it's a huge utilities company like Vivendi Veolia from France, okay? And so you have loads of different things, but suddenly it turns out you're in the fossil fuel electricity generating area, and people don't want fossil fuel generation, they want renewable generation. But you might fight tooth and nail as a manager to retain the size of your department and retain the investment in it, even though everyone knows that the chances are that investment in fossil fuel, is going to go down, and investment in renewables is going to go up. And so that manager in that circumstances is not acting in the best interests of the shareholders. Okay, they're only concerned that, well, I started off as the biggest division in here, and I am going to fight tooth and nail to remain the biggest division, even if even if we are no longer delivering the same amount of profit. Does that make sense to everybody? We will go into agency theory in a lot more detail when we start to deal with corporate governance later on. Is that okay with everyone? And so, a couple of things to think about in this, and we'll take a break. I think we're almost finished these slides, so let's just have a look. What number are we on? 10 of 11. How do you like that? See the way I made 11 slides last that long? That's awesome, isn't it? So, years of blabbering for Ireland. Okay. So, in this scenario, when we talk about the power matrix here, we're talking about two issues. We're talking about how interested is the stakeholder and what power can they yield. So what influence can they actually yield? Okay. And the basic idea is we look at each of our stakeholder types, we see how they fall within this chart, and then we use that to make a decision on what is the best way to actually manage that stakeholder relationship. Okay? And so, for example, if you have somebody who's a stakeholder but has very low interest and very low power, okay, all you will do is give a minimal effort to dealing with them. Okay? So, technically, by buying this bottle of Coca-Cola. I am a stakeholder of the Coca-Cola company. However, I have very low interest in the day-to-day runnings of Coca-Cola company, and I also have very little power, even if I had an interest. So they don't need to do anything to manage me, other than not put poison in the Coke. I'm happy, or don't make the bottles. And this nearly threw me off, where they brought back cherry Coke for a while recently, but you couldn't tell from the bottle. It was very difficult to see. All the colours are the same now on the bottles, and so I accidentally drank cherry Coke. Oh, it was so
Oh, no,
depressing.
cherry coke.
Oh no, it's God's. Oh no, 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 it's the devil's
Pocket
own
cherry
work.
coke and like
No,
soft.
no, please, no. Okay, so there's nothing I can, I can give out about it, but there's nothing I can do about it. On the other hand, you can have groups that have a high level of interest but are have a low level of power nonetheless. Okay, so there may be people who are just genuinely interested in things. So again, if from a corporate point of view, these may be people that are industry watchers. They could have some kind of they could be bloggers. They could be, you know, kind of lower level journalists or something like that. And the job there is that they don't have much power, but their interest means that potentially that they could keep plodding along. And bear in mind that somebody who has low power today could end up having high power later on down the line. So just because you sit in a particular quadrant now doesn't mean you stay there. But in this case, the main thing to do is keep them informed. Okay, so just keep them up to date on stuff. If they are an entity that has a low level of interest but a high level of um, power, then the main thing is to keep them satisfied. Now, for a very long time, and probably it's still the case, although they'll try and pretend they're showing interest now, um, corporate investors, so people like insurance companies who put the money, who put the insurance, or not the insurance, the pension pot into shares as an investment. Didn't really care what the company was doing on a day-to-day basis. They often didn't need, even though they might have been one of the biggest shareholders in the company, they often didn't attend AGMs, or if they did, they just voted in favor of what management wanted all the way down the line. And so they have high power, but if they've no interest, as long as you keep them satisfied, they're not going to get edgy or want to actually make changes. Although there has been a strong push to try and get that group in particular, the professional fund managers, to actually pay attention to what goes on in the companies that they invest in. And you do, again, that's part of where CSR, corporate social responsibility, has come out of as well. And then finally, you have somebody who is both has both a high level of interest and high power, and that person is a key player, and you really need to manage that relationship as best as you can. And so, if you think about it, um, if you are a large, let's say somebody like a pharmaceutical manufacturer in this country, then the Environmental Protection Agency here has a very strong amount of power in relation to what you do, and he's also very interested. Okay, so they will do visits, they will check to make sure that you're complying with how much waste you're pumping into water, how you're handling any dangerous chemicals you have, and so on. And so you really need to stay on top of your game in dealing with that relationship. Does that make sense to everybody? So this is probably not the first time or the last time you'll see Menlo, but this is referred to as Menlo's matrix in relation to stakeholders. So depends on the level of power and interest that you have as to what the appropriate approach is. And this one in particular is interesting because you think, well, if somebody has a lot of power, I always need to be worried about them. In one sense, you do, but you have people who have power who just have no interest. As I said, traditionally, there were lots of investment funds where that was actually the case. They had no interest in the day-to-day running. They had to be forced. So, CHOP Limited is a forestry business which leases several large woodlands from central government of Country Z. It currently employs 2,000 members of staff across the country. CHOP supplies over 300 small businesses with wood across Country Z. However, recently its profitability has been poor and it's been struggling to pay any dividends. This has angered the company's 3 shareholders who each own around 20% of Chop Capital's shares. Okay? Well, where's the other 40%? That's what I want to know. Maybe some of them own others. Okay, the remainder is owned by the public, with no one investor owning more than 1% of the total share capital. There's the answer to that question. The 3 main shareholders have asked the board of directors to consider making 200 employees redundant. The employees are not heavily unionized. State the appropriate strategy for Menlo's matrix for each of the following. So firstly, we have the customers. Okay, so how many customers are there? Does it say?
300.
300. Okay, so in terms of power, what kind of power would 300, would one individual customer out of a group of 300 generally have?
Depends how much supplies they're buying.
It would depend, but in general, you would expect there's not a huge amount of power at 300. Yeah, so there's not a lot of power. But are they interested? Yeah. So if we go back to this matrix, they're low power but high interest. Okay. So the appropriate treatment for them is to keep them informed. Okay. Does that make sense to everyone? And so for the next one, the major shareholders, are they high powered? Yeah. And have they a high interest? Yeah. Okay. Very much, and even in this case, for the three main shareholders, they're actually showing that they're taking an interest in the question by saying that they've expressed their dissatisfaction. They're not just passive investors who are just waiting to see what happens. They're in some ways active. So again, in this situation, what's their level of interest? High. What's their level of power? High. So they're a key player. You need to manage them very closely. Okay. Next one is the employees. Okay. Now this is an interesting one. What kind of power do they have? How many of them is there first? 2,000. Okay. There's 2,000 of them. Do we know anything else about them? It doesn't appear to be a trade union. There's nothing like that there. So they don't have any kind of collective power in bargaining, therefore. So, again, 2,000, they are probably on the low powered side. Does that make sense?
It's only 200 of the 2,000 as well.
Yes, so even within that,
Yeah.
that's lower as well, exactly. And again, however, I mean, it's very easy to argue what kind of interest do they have. If it's about your job, they're fascinated. So again, they're very high interest, but very low power. So keep informed, as opposed to keeping them satisfied. You know what I mean? In that kind of scenario, or them being key players, they're not under any of those two headings. Doesn't mean it can't go wrong, or if they decided to unionize because this is after happening, that could shift their position in the matrix.
So they could move into key satisfied.
Yeah, or even all the way up to a key player. So if they fully unionized all 2,000 members, and that trade union got very militant, then that would be a very powerful force acting within the business there. And finally, the government in this scenario. Okay, and so in this case, they operate in country Z, they employ in country Z, and their shareholders, doesn't say definitively where the shareholders are, but even at that, all of its operations appear to be in country Z. Okay, so in that situation, does the government have a lot of power?
Yeah.
It does, because they're only operating in that state, and therefore the government has a lot of power. And does the government have a lot of interest? Yeah, on balance they actually do. And they may not pay it on a day-to-day basis, but I can guarantee you, if there's talk of cutting 200 jobs from anywhere, there's several government departments that instantly take an interest in that kind of area. So again, they would be actually high power, high interest, and so they would fall under that key player definition. Does that make sense to everyone? So that's the way this matrix actually works. The reason I say that is because we're dealing with political and legal issues that apply to a firm. And if you've ever done anything along this line before and you've looked at strategy, you'll know that one tool that's often used to assess strategy is referred to as pest analysis, where pest stands for political, economic, social, and technical. And so in this case, the political and legal is the P part of it. Okay, and so the issue is for an organization, we have to be thinking about political. Even though I was going to say political with a small p, even though I have it written with a big P here, we're not talking about political parties per se, or although lots of companies play around in that area as well. In this scenario, we're much more talking about the overall political environment, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable, and the legal framework that's in place in there. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so in this one, we're going to talk about things like the systems that are in place for politics, and we're also going to talk about government policy and how it can affect organizations. Okay, so government comes up with ways of doing things. It enacts laws, and those laws have a knock-on effect on how organizations do their business. Okay, it can be as simple as bringing in a law that says the minimum wage is now €10.25 an hour or whatever. I don't know what it actually is at this stage. Sorry. I'll have to check. I'll have a look anyway. Okay. On the other hand, it could be much more. It could put you out of business. So tomorrow, next week, I know there's a study being reported that's going to be released that shows vaping has negative effects, and so the next thing you know, possibly governments start to move down the road of banning vaping the way they did smoking previously. Although I want to be very careful with that, because I still have to believe, I don't know, but I have to believe that smoking is more, and I don't do either, just to be clear. And I don't sell vaping products either, so I have no interest in it. But just from the fact that you don't have tar and everything else in the vape, I have to think vaping is at least healthier than smoking. That if you're going to make vaping illegal but make cigarettes legal, that seems to be over madness.
I think the sanction for it as well was because it was like the public perception as opposed to the actual
Yeah.
damage that's caused.
Yeah, I do know that there was just today I noticed. I think it was on my Twitter stream that there is something being released, some research being released, which does show it has some health, at least some health impacts.
So the breathing air.
Yeah, and that's they have to, and that's what I'm saying, that you could, you could be in a position. I know they're worried, and I did see it just the other day, 16 and 17-year-olds wandering around vaping. They've never smoked. They went straight to vaping. So that has its own issues as well. But is it any different to this? Well, nicotine is a lot more addictive than caffeine, but is it doing more or less than this once you actually take it? Those are the questions, and that's kind of when it comes back to government policy. Bad government policy is often government policy that's just shot from the hip after reading something once. Does that make sense to everyone? But we'll talk about that as we go. Sources of legal authority, including supernatural bodies, in other words, bodies that are above national governments or national parliaments. So any modern country, as well as dealing with its own people, has to deal with everything from the United Nations to the EU, if you're in the EU, World Trade Organization. We should be hearing a lot about that over the next few months again, and so many other entities that tie in there. What else have we got? If you were a NATO member, we're not, but if you're a NATO member, you have NATO. If you were what else can you be a member of? World Health Organization, and so on. Look, you can name a lot, but there's a lot of organizations out there that it can also either bring in rules, or it can be agreed collectively that countries are going to bring in ways of dealing with things. So if you remember, before it's been a little devalued with the US withdrawing from it. We have a Paris Climate Accord, which says countries are going to try and deal with carbon emissions in certain ways. and that's come from a level above just the Irish government sitting there and going, yeah, we think we should do this because it's important. Does that make sense to everyone? So that's what we mean by supranational bodies. Law that protects employees. So there is a set of laws that say how many hours you can work, when you should get breaks, and what constitutes health and safety risks, etc. And so those laws are there to protect employee rights and also to protect employees' health. And so we've health and safety in the workplace. We've the whole data protection area, and so data protection is a significant area and became really significant about 3 days ago when the Data Protection Commissioner decided that the Irish government had infringed the data of 3.2 million citizens in this country through their compulsory use of the public services card. Okay. Sorry, not because of their compulsory use of the public services card, but because they didn't have appropriate legal authority to require it, which is different. Because the GDPR specific law specifically says you can bring in a law to require its use or to put its use in place. But they didn't bother their behinds bringing in a law. They just told everyone they had to start using it.
Is that why they got rid of the union from the registers for life?
All of those things. Yeah, yeah. So literally, they've been found to have infringed. I've never held one, but I think they reckon about 3.2 million people have held a public services card out of a population of 4.5, 4.6. So that's the vast majority of the population, and those 3.2 could all go to court and try to sue the government. Yeah, anyone that has one could try and sue the government now.
Never get it
Hmm? No, and this is, just to be very clear, this is not because it's illegal to have such a card. Lots of EU countries have identification cards. Lots of them have compulsory identification cards. The issue here is that there is a push against compulsory identification cards. It's low level. It's not something we're madly wedded to. But there's always, if it's ever mooted, there's going to be a compulsory identity card in this country. Somebody puts their head up and goes, "Oh, that'll infringe on all our rights. I don't want one." And usually the government caves very quickly. But it's perfectly, and I think you could easily have a law for a public services card as well. They just did not bother their behind. Social protection had a card, and they all bailed in most of them without having proper legal authority to
Stop
actually
to
do
the
it.
card ID card as well. Or stop calling or something.
It's an interesting one. The difference would be that the Garda one is not compulsory. So if you want to get certain services, you have to have that card. Okay, so you have to have the public services card. If you want to sign on, or if you want to go into, there's lots of things now. I'd have to think of them all. Signing on is the obvious one, but there was lots of situations where people were trying to require you to present that public service. I think things like getting a medical card and lots of other stuff. They wanted you to present this card before you could get them. But other than for social welfare payments, there's no legal basis for, it turns out, for requiring people. And they will suffer for it. And the other thing about the law is that we generally don't have. I just found this out on Tuesday. I knew the first part. I didn't know the second part. We don't have any law that allows what the Americans have, which is kind of group court cases. What's they call them again? Can I remember what do you call cases where you bring all the people together? I can't remember the name of it. Hmm?
Syndicate.
No, I'll think of it in a minute anyway because I have no brain. It'll come to me. But this actually allows you to get everyone together and take one of these kinds of cases. And generally we don't do that. If you want to sue, you sue yourself. But you can now sue as a group. So you can all hire the same lawyer and sue as a group. And it'll come to me in a minute. My brain's getting slow. I'm getting old. Feel sorry for me. I'll come back to it now. Explain how law promotes health and safety, recognise responsibilities in relation to data protection, etc. And so you do always have the issue of rights versus responsibilities. So if you have a right to health and safety as an employee, you have a responsibility not to break dance in the middle of the manufacturing floor while you're at work. Does that make sense? Um, don't mess with machinery. Get proper training. If there's if there's safety equipment in use in the organization, then you use that safety equipment. If you're not trained to use it, you don't go near it. Okay, and so on. All of these things are part of your duty as the employee to try and not get into those issues. And then there's the issue of consumer protection. And one thing I'd say when we get there at the time, just to bear in mind, in your book, the book appears to um, point a lot at the UK consumer protection stuff. Our consumer protection laws are not nearly as strong as the UK's consumer protection laws. Okay, so just bear that in mind when you're reading it. You'll notice I put in stuff that's slightly different to what's in the book. That's because their laws are different. Um, just to know that. Okay, so analyzing the internal environment. So I mentioned pest analysis already: political, economic, social, and technical. Sometimes it's pestle, so to put that L on the end, it's expanding the P, the political out, which always encompassed the law originally, and now has legal thrown in there as well, and then you can turn it around and call it step instead of pestle, pest, and then there's even pestle with an E, where E stands for ecological or environmental on top of all of the others. But fundamentally, it's just a framework to build your analysis on. So that, in other words, it's saying, I want to know what's going on outside my organization that could have an impact on my organization. And you're then therefore asked the questions, what thing in the political spheres are going on? Okay, so is there new laws coming? Does the government appear to be pro something or anti something else? Um, you know, is there, is there a possible long-term change to government policy, etc. All of those things would fall in there. Um, and you break each one of those down in turn. The economic is about what's the economy like at the moment. Is it good? Is it bad? Where in the economic cycle are we? And that's a very interesting question right now. Right now, even 6 months ago, we would have said we were still. It still looked pretty good. There wasn't really much actual negative stuff there. There might have been things to worry about, but there wasn't negative. But I think the last couple of weeks are very potentially pointing towards we could be heading for some form of recession, global recession again. So the German, you don't know if you saw Germany. Germany is lending money now over 10 years, where you have to pay them or sorry, they're taking loans of money where you have to pay them for them borrowing the money from you. So you know that usually when you're in a bank and you take out a loan, you pay interest. You're basically now paying the German government for borrowing money from you. Isn't that great? And some of the shorter ones have been there for a while. The new one is over the next 10 years. There's now loans out there. Same as happened in the US. There's been a crossover in what's called a yield curve crossover, where the what's being charged for certain bonds is crossed over from the long term versus the short term. But that means what it indicates is every time that's happened over the last 9 times, it has been a precursor to a recession. Okay, and so there's now real stuff starting to appear, and the US, despite all this stuff was going great, revised its jobs figures there for the last 6 months and said that it actually created 500,000 jobs less than it had announced previously. So these are things we have to watch out for. Anyway, this is what you analyze. What are the economics? What are the social issues? And I mean that comes down to things that are as simple as what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in a particular society. And it means your firm has to make a decision on what way it's going to go on these kinds of things. Doesn't mean that just because things are, attitudes are a particular way, you have to adopt those. It's more recognizing that if you decide to go against the grain, you have to think about what impact that may have on you and how you're either going to mitigate it, or maybe by being the rebel company, that will be what gets you to be more successful, because eventually everyone realizes you were right. which is what we want, isn't it? If we get in there first, and that's the social. Technical then is what's technically feasible. What can we do now? So, um, we can assert that we want to do certain things, or we want to manufacture a certain way, or we want to produce certain things. But if we don't actually look at the state of the art at the moment, we don't look at what can be done and what can't be done, you're planning in a vacuum. Does that make sense? So you can say anything. I will now build a car in 3 hours, and it's one you can build in a classroom. And three, two, one, and go. It's great to say that, but you know what? Technically, completely infeasible. It's not. It's not possible. Class action suit. Thank you. Told you to come back to me, didn't I? So that court case is called a class action. That style of court case. Um, have you ever heard that term before? No. Okay, it's in the States. If you, do you ever any of you ever watched the film Erin Brockovich? Yeah, you know the way she went around getting everybody. That's a class action lawsuit. So everyone that was poisoned by that company, um, she went around, got them all together, and that case is called a class action because they're all gathered together as a single group rather than each getting their own lawyer and suing individually. There you go. Thank God. It's only mild Alzheimer's then, as opposed to serious. So, as I said, political can have a lot of stuff that's in there. It could be ecological issues as they apply to government. There's a picture. That's actually quite a nice picture of Dáil Éireann, isn't it? Current legislation that's in place. So, what does the legislation say in terms of doing things? Future legislation. So, quite often you can see what the future is going to be like because the government will often in advance say we are going to move towards something else. Sometimes it's because the EU has said it, so the EU says we've brought in a set of rules that have been agreed by the governments. Governments have 3 years within which to implement them. Okay, or some other organisation does it. So it might be that the Basel Banking Committee has said this is now the rules that should apply to banks for their minimum capital requirements. And so you know that's coming. Sometimes the government will actually make an announcement that say over the next 3 years we're going to increase the amount of the percentage of salary that employees can put into a pension scheme from A to B, or we're going to cut the taxes from A to B, or we're going to do things like that as well. So you can find out about these things in advance also. And also there is a legislation timetable. If you go onto the Dáil website, or the Oireachtas website, sorry, and you look at, you can actually see every piece of law that's currently progressing its way through the Oireachtas. Does that make sense? So you can literally see. Now, the issue with that is it may not look anything like as the law is at the moment. So, the law gets changed, things get taken out, things get put in, amendments get made before it's actually finally enacted. But, it'd be pretty close. You then have regulatory bodies and regulatory processes all over the place. So I mentioned the Environmental Protection Agency previously. So if you're in an industry where there's a chance of pollution, or where you're handling, acid or strange chemicals, or you're burning stuff, then the EPA is going to pay an interest in you. Then if you drive a taxi, okay, the Road Transport Authority are going to pay an interest in you. If you run a bus company, I don't know what the bus one is called. Might be the Road Transport Authority as well, but the rail one then is the Rail Transport Authority. Accountants, the bodies themselves are regulators and are established to a certain extent. So the ACCA is technically a regulator in certain circumstances, and in turn there is actually a regulator that sits above the ACCA as well. Government body, I think I mentioned to you last week, based out in Naas, called the Irish Auditing and Accounting Supervisory Authority. Okay, and so you have all of those regulatory bodies. You have government policies themselves. So governments can have different policies on how they think things should be treated, and that may not even be something that's written into law per se. It may be that they're pro something and anti something else, and so they may use existing tools to ignore something. So if we got a new government, elected, and they were incredibly anti-high-rise buildings, they could start using the planning system to go in constantly themselves and object to everything. And in certain circumstances, there's some government organisations that have special entitlement to do that. One is Air Rienta out of the airport. Um, and one of the dodgiest things I've ever seen on Irish television was a guy who was interviewed by RTE. I only ever saw this reporter on RTE once doing this interview, and he never appeared again. And it might be because he caught everybody out. Okay, so he went up, and what was after happening was that there was a developer who'd bought land out in a certain part of the flight path into the airport, and the law says that Air to the people that actually control the airport, can object to building in particular areas. So, they were alongside existing industrial buildings and so on. They said we want to build an additional industrial estate or whatever, and Air objected, and so they couldn't get planning permission. But when that happened, when that was finished, Air swooped in, bought the land, and the industrial estate themselves. So it didn't look like a safety reason anymore. It was purely an abuse of their position for commercial purposes, and they got hammered for it by this guy at the time. And the guy this was the most amazing thing. The guy that Areta put up to be interviewed, and he said, like, he spouted. I mean, he set the trap for him, because he said, you objected to this. Oh yeah, safety, 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 safety. And after about 10 minutes of safety, safety, he just said, but you bought the land and then you built this yourself. And your man just looked at the camera and said, you got me. Like, no, even. And he was right, there was no, and it was wrong. I mean, in most countries that would be considered corrupt. They may not have nobody may have stolen the money afterwards, but it was never intended that Arienta would use that power so that they could make a profit out of it down the line. It was never intended for that, so it's never happened again, as far as I know. But in fairness to both sides, your man actually just said there, and go, yeah, you got me. That was awesome. So you can have, you will also have times when governments are changing, and you will have times where governments are changing very quickly. We don't have that now. We went through a period of time where governments were only lasting 18 months, during the 80s especially. Governments just didn't last any length of time. You just had elections. And there was years where there was 2 elections in a year for over a period. You still have that in some countries. The obvious one is Italy. It looks like the Italian government is in trouble again. The Italian government is never far from trouble. Italy is great, but the Italian government seems to be mental. Any Italians here? No, that's good. Okay. I'm not insulting any Italians, but I think most Italians know that this kind of going for elections every 12 to 18 months and completely switching systems is just madness. But sometimes these things are built into the system and they're very hard to get out. But when that's happening, clearly, if you're switching from a government with one philosophy to another, you're in an interesting time and you have to try and reorganize yourself as you go through. Then things like trading policies. What are the policies with regards to supporting trading? Does the government provide lots of grants and supports to support, say, exporting, or does it support something else? So traditionally, and it's still the case, we have tended to support businesses that would export, rather than supporting domestic businesses that are working to grab customers within the country. You don't get the big grants to set up, even a very successful IT company if that company is only targeting, this country. Does that make sense to everyone? But if you were to be doing the same thing but targeting France with it, Enterprise Ireland be delighted to talk to you and see how they can agree stuff with you. So all these funding initiatives are there. How the lobbying is done and how pressure groups operate. And so again, different countries have different highly organized and strong groups within them. So traditionally it's still the case, but they're not as strong as they used to be. By far the biggest and best organized lobby in this country was farmers. Okay, so the Irish Farmers Association was the equivalent of the National Rifle Association of the US. It was by far the best and strongest lobbying body in this country. Uh, could still now mobilise 10,000 people to drive tractors up to agriculture houses they wanted to. They don't do so much of that. There was a time when that was their thing. They'd close the city down, so they'd all get in their tractors and they'd all just drive up the motorways at rush hour and then just come in. Before that, another time they went through a period where they'd bring cattle or sheep in and they'd actually herd them into the department. So there'd be people sitting inside in reception. The next thing, there's sheep running in past them, sitting in reception. There was one recently where a couple of lads occupied the department, although I think they might have been over egging it a bit because they were showing them sitting on, we're staying here, we're not going anywhere, and then like literally 2 minutes later they're outside taking a cup of tea off somebody. So, and I mean because the lobby is so powerful, they've gotten away with doing things that no other lobby group would do. So nobody else would be able to come onto the streets to that extent, and cause that level of delay and be able. So it depends on your power, and sometimes you get a shock. So one of the interesting things now, this was kind of 2009, 2010, and they started to look at cutting pensions. Okay, so they cut a lot of other stuff, but they hadn't touched the pension. There was talks of it, and the one of the elderly organisations organised a thing, and I think it was even a surprise to them. They got thousands in front of the door. They got thousands of elderly. I'm never voting for them again, and wearing T-shirts and they all said like it looked really well. And the age-old thing that applies worldwide is that guess who votes? Old people vote. Guess who don't vote? Young people don't vote. Okay, so when they saw 15,000 older people on the streets of Dublin, they just backpedal, backpedal, backpedal. what is this pension cut you talk of? And no cut at all in the pension, whereas every other payment was cut.
Like the Irish water charges.
Yeah, but you see, the thing about the water charges is they were vociferous and they eventually won, but it took them so long because they just didn't have the power when they started off with someone like the Irish Farmers Association. You could nearly say for the water charges, and I have my views on water charges, but like what they did was that they basically kept going. It was only by just not letting it drop and by them having a base level of support that eventually it became so difficult to run the thing that the government kind of says we surrender. But on the other hand, the elderly only had to turn up once. They just turned up, 15,000 of them, all wearing yellow and red T-shirts, standing outside Dáil Éireann. All had been interviewed by RT and saying, "I voted Fianna Fáil all my life, and I'm never voting for them again." And that was the end of it. Oh my God! Yeah, because that they know, that those political machines locally know what that means to them, and they could not. You've never seen a minister run backwards as quick as they did over that period of time. So that's the political. On the economic, so the E side of the pest analysis is economic. So first question would be, where are we in terms of the current economic situation? Is it good or is it bad? Okay, so that's the first obvious question. You might also go from there, would kind of fall under the next couple as well, is where are we in the economic cycle? Okay, so in economics, we always go through cycles. Okay, we have a period of time where it's very good or relatively good, and then we have a period of time where it's not so good. The only real question that arises is, how good is the good and how bad is the bad? Does that make sense to everyone? In the long term, in economics, generally things go up, but they do not go up in a straight line. So you have periods of time where it goes up quite quickly, and then it comes off for a period of time as well. And so that's sometimes referred to as boom and bust, if you've heard that term before. So a boom is when things go really well, and the economy is booming, it's going ahead, it's doing well, and then you bust or you have the economy going down, and it can be relatively benign. So you mightn't grow a lot, but you don't fall a lot on the other hand. But quite often, economies that grow very quickly in the good times fall very quickly in the bad times. And so, to take Germany as an example, Germany, in advance of World War II, which caused a lot of the destabilization in there, had in the early 30s had a fairly big sized boom, followed by a major crash. And I think it was one of those things where, so it's an important question to ask: where are we in the cycle? And so what you have here is you have two sets of bonds. Okay, so this is just documents, pieces of paper that the government issues to say, please give me a loan. Here's the paper to say how much I'm going to pay you. Okay, generally the interest rate is higher on longer length loans and shorter on lower on near term ones. Okay, and so you follow all of this through. Very nice. So this orange one here is a 10-year. Is it? Yeah, it is 10-year. So that means that the government issues a loan over 10 years. Okay, and the purple one is 2 years, so they issue a loan over 2 years. So you can see here that at this time originally in August of whenever this is, in the yield curve, in other words, the amount that the government has to pay for the loan in this case, for 10-year money it was paying whatever that is, 2.2%, say it is 2.1%, and it's only paying 1.85% there, give or take. And so that's fine, that's what you kind of expect. But you have a problem here, which is that they cross over. And generally, what's happened here is that they've crossed over, and that the 10-year has gotten cheaper than the 2-year. Does that make sense? Now, in the US, every time that's happened, it has been the precursor to a recession. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, and so that's just one small example of an economic indicator or an economic trend. German government says we want to borrow money over 10 years. Normally they will say, and we will pay you this amount of interest. But you can see here at the moment with the I was saying it to you a little earlier, with 10 years, that's a minus. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so at the moment you will pay the German government over half of 1% for them to borrow from you. That's awesome, isn't it? And so again, generally, if we look at this, if this table, oh here it is, I can actually see it here. Did it come up? No, here, there we go. If you look at this chart here, you'll see that what has it got against me? Let's move on. Anyway, we won't worry about it, but you can look at charts like this. I'm not actually asking you to look at the charts, but if you look at charts like this, you can see movements, and at particular times, depending on what you're looking at, it would tell you something. Clearly, somebody, anytime, and I mean anytime, somebody says to you, you have to pay me to loan for the privilege of you loaning money to me, that's a fundamental red flag, isn't it? Okay, it's something that says, it's usually an indicator in that type of scenario that people are worried about the economy going into the future. Because if I thought I was going to make loads of money on the stock market, I wouldn't pay the German government to mine my money for me. However, if I wasn't sure, or I thought I could lose loads of money on the stock market, or by buying real estate, or even by just keeping my money in the bank, so if I thought inflation was going to be very high, or something else was going to happen, then it can make sense in that situation. And so you can see that little line there, you can see is still at minus 0.64. So to get up to positive, that's zero interest rates all the way up there. So you can just see it's been on an ongoing deterioration since basically end of Mayish. Does that make sense? So if you are watching this, if this was your full-time job and your job was to look at economic trends, you might look at the trend in the German um, bonds, and that might be one of your indicators as to how you assess the economy is doing as a whole. The overall trends will give you an idea of what the economic position is. Most people would say 10-year notes at a negative with a negative interest rate on them would be a concerning issue because investors are willing. Now they didn't get all of that away, but they got quite a chunk of it away when they issued it the other day. And the other stuff that's trading at the moment on markets, its yield is down at those kinds of levels. So it's something that is potentially an indicator of an upcoming recession. No two ways about it. Okay, does that make sense to everyone? Okay, is there anything we can do about it? Probably not a lot. That's the truth, unfortunately. Then you've all the other issues. So taxation. So governments make choices with tax. They make choices on what they are going to tax and what they're not going to tax. Okay, and that can have an impact on business. So, for example, in the U.S., they have no federal tax on dividends, so they don't tax, the returns that you make on companies. Their idea being, we want as many people as possible to invest in companies. They want to promote share ownership. On the other hand, you pay dividend withholding tax in this country, so you pay tax on dividends here, and so that means that in certain circumstances I might be more tempted to invest in US stocks than Irish stocks because it's more tax efficient. But then I have to leave the money over there. There's a whole, you know what I mean? There's a whole load of different issues that potentially arise there. But, certainly a decision to do something with tax can push a lot of money into the economy or push a lot of money out of the economy as well. So it's one of those things. You do have seasonality issues. Okay, so at different times of the years things are available. Not as significant as it used to be, but because now you just kind of fly stuff straight up from South Africa or over from South America and so on. But traditionally you didn't buy oranges in January. You didn't buy them cheaply in January, if we can put them that way. They had to be shipped in from a long way off and so on. But you do still have seasonality. You also have weather issues. So if the weather gets bad, that can impact on certain industries. So we've had a relatively good summer this year, so probably the ice cream companies have done well, and so on. And then you'll find that there's some places that have done even worse than usual. If it was a really bad summer, then the ice cream companies would probably not do well at all. And all the summer stock of clothing that's in all the shops won't sell because if it's lashing rain and cold, I'm not buying that nice new T-shirt that's going to make me look cool. Okay, and so on. Just I'm not going to do it, so it has an impact as well. Then there's market-specific issues about where we are in the cycle. So as I said, economics goes up and goes down. It's a cyclical area, so it is never just a straight trend line. Does that make sense to everyone? If you look at it over 50 years, you can easily make it look like a straight line, but it never actually is a straight line. There's up times and there's down times. And I mean, we have actually had kind of 2009, 2010, we had deflation. So our economy actually contracted. It got smaller instead of getting bigger. Okay, so usually it's bad enough if we worry about just the economy slowing down from 5% down to 1%. But we had this situation where for about 12 to 18 months the economy actually got smaller and smaller and smaller, and that's the worry that's there. You then have specific industries. So over time, industries are going to be impacted by developments. So industries are going to either maybe they'll automate and suddenly what you used to have to pay €100 for, you now can pay €3 for, and that can apply in any kind of walk of life. If you bought, I think, widescreen TVs. Okay, so if you went and bought a 50-inch high definition TV 10 years ago, there was a period of time, might be longer than 10 years ago now, where it was like €10,000, €12,000 to get one of them. Now you could get a 40 to 50 inch one for €300. Not saying it'd be a good one. That's a different question, but you would get one for that kind of money. And if you get it out a little, it nearly always is. Best TV I own from a picture point of view, I bought in Lidl. It's a 32-inch high def picture. It's fantastic on it, you know. Although I was in, very unfortunately, I was in PC World the other day, and I was looking at there's a new technology called OLED, organic LED. Oh my God, it's unbelievable. Uh, but I can't. But now, even the interesting thing there is the new technology 10 years ago was 12 grand. Top of the range TV for that, which I still won't be buying. Just to be clear, won't be buying it. By Sony in there, full OLED was €3,500 for the top of the range. That would be 1,000 times better than what you would have been buying 10 years ago for the 10 grand. So that's a huge, like, there's new technology where the 10, it looks like this time around with the, that we have the whole ultra high definition on the TVs as well. There wasn't, I don't think there was ever 10 or 12 grand TVs for that at any stage. But by the time they were released into the market properly, even the higher end ones were at, were already coming down at probably around 2,500. But to get an OLED you 4K TV for 3.5 grand is a complete switch in the market. Anyway, that's just so in the market, Sony maybe 10 years ago, if they released a TV of that standard, would expect to be able to charge 12 or 14,000 euro for at least a period of time. This thing is brand new into the market because they've only the technology is the technology that you've had in your phone screens for ages, but they haven't been able to scale it up, so they haven't been able to make it big into big screens, so they could make it into little screens. They've just sorted the technology in kind of the last 18 months, so it's brand new technology. In the past, that would always have sold for a couple of years for crazy money, and I mean mega crazy money, whereas now, that's just not there, which is again a sign the market is moving. It's just one industry factor there. Market routes and distribution trends. So how things are, how markets are accessed. I mean, we have an interesting thing with that at the moment because with our friends in Brexit, we're suddenly becoming a seafaring nation again. Okay, so we have bought or contracted in or hired. I think we're up to about 6 ferries at this stage. And there's 3 or 4 new ferry routes that are after opening. There's one that's going to go shortly, I think, from, I can't remember if it's Wexford or Cork down to the north of Spain. There's at least 2 ferries that are going to bypass the UK and go straight to Rotterdam. These will all be goods ferries now. They won't be people ferries. There won't be a lot of people on it. And then there's new ones going straight to Normandy as well. And so that's because we just don't know what's going to happen. And so we have a change in our market routes at the moment, because if tomorrow morning, you can no longer just drive a truck onto a ferry in Dublin, drive it off in Holyhead, drive it down to Dover and cross over again, then if you have to go through 2 lots of customs just to do that, and it could go from taking 6 hours to 2 days. Does that make sense? Or more. And so that can change your economic issues. Customer end users. So ultimately, we have to sell to somebody. So and this is where the bad side vicious circle kicks in. So if the economy starts to contract, then there's pressure on wages. Pressure on wages means that people buy less. People buying less means there's pressure on the company, and therefore they will probably try and put their prices up and or start to sack people, and that just turns into a vicious circle where you just have a spiral down of the economy. Does that make sense? And so you have those issues as well, and then the interest rates and the exchange rates can have an impact as well. So for example, at the moment, the British pound has kind of lost an incredible amount of value over the last kind of 8 to 10 weeks. So you can be sure that all of a sudden Irish farming products are a lot more expensive in the UK than they were, say, January of this year, okay, because it's literally gone from about 130, 135 down to 107, you know. So that's about a 30% drop in the value of the, say it's a good 20-25% drop in the value of the British pound against the euro since January. That makes sense to everyone. So that has a knock-on effect. So if anytime there's trade between two currency areas, the relative value of those currencies is going to be important. That makes sense to everyone, you know, and so and it goes both ways. So what that does encourage generally then is, you know, you may end up importing more and getting things cheaper for a while at least. So buy your electronics on Amazon now because the exchange rate is so good. Before you have to put, you know, in 8 weeks time, 10 weeks time, you could have to fill out a customs declaration form to order stuff, you know, from the UK. That's literally where we are at the moment. You know, I don't know how it's going to end up. I kind of in the back of my head, I think I thought that it was going to be fixed, but I'm not convinced now at all. I think they could just go goodbye, and that'll be it, and it'll just be a disaster all around because, you know. Anyway, lots of reasons. So the other things you have to think about is social trends. Then, so what's going on? Things like population and lifestyle. Okay, demographics, consumer attitudes, what people think about branding and imaging and all of those kinds of things. All of these social trends are important. They define how people are going to consume within the market. And all of these things can have a very long and continuous impact on a country. And then you have the technology. Okay, so technology is constantly changing, it's constantly accelerating, it's constantly changing things. So I'm teaching a little bit on artificial intelligence as well at the moment. And that was something that had kind of slowed down. So there was lots of time. You remember films where, you know, people were suddenly robots and people were nearly the same. You remember all those films? That was kind of the first wave when artificial intelligence was talked about first. Well, you know, eventually computers are just going to be like people. They're going to think the same. They're going to have all the same knowledge. It'll be, you know, that's how it is. And then this is absolutely true. Two mathematicians sat down and looked at the way AI was being done at the time and just did out a mathematical calculation and said, it's never going to happen. That's how everyone went. Okay, and research into artificial intelligence just faded away. And then about 4 or 5, it's only in the last 4 or 5 years, somebody came up with the concept of what's now called deep learning. Have you ever heard that term, deep learning? Doesn't matter. It's just a way of artificial intelligence being trained. And they suddenly worked out, well, hold on, you don't have to have just one layer of learning. You can have loads of different layers. And those loads of different layers mean that suddenly it's accelerated again. And so suddenly artificial intelligence is absolutely top, you know, it's absolutely firing along again. And it's all because of this. We can have 5 layers of learning, which is kind of how your brain works with neurons and so on. And so that's why we're suddenly back again. So it's all coming. The robots will be in charge 5 to 10 minutes. That's a joke. Okay, they won't. I don't think they ever will. But, you know, interesting things will come along over time because part of artificial intelligence is that they will learn themselves. Okay. Now, the question is, what will they learn? You know, it doesn't mean that they're suddenly going to become sentient beings. It may mean that because they can crunch so much data, which is the power on it, maybe they can spot fraud that a human being can't see because they can analyze patterns that if I have 450 pages of spreadsheets, I can't just sit there with a highlighter and go, that looks interesting. You know, like I'll get there in about 50 years, whereas the computer can do that in 2 minutes. You know, and so that's more likely what we're talking about. And then some of the autonomous stuff as well. You know, whether it's, you know, the other Amazon big proposal is on top of everything else they're doing, they want to have drones delivering the presents. Yeah. Yeah. But the thing about them was they would be entirely autonomous. They will just fly to your house and drop the stuff in. And they have another version that rolls along the footpath. It's about the size of a large dog, and it has 4 wheels on it, and it just drives along the footpath.
What do you call them? Presents.
What's that?
The company called Amazon purchase presents.
Yeah.
Yourself, is it?
It's for me, yeah. I'm just, yeah. Actually, that's true. Sorry, I didn't even catch myself doing that. Cook cat. No, because I was like, what I was actually thinking of was one of the versions of it, and I don't know how that would really work here. It's supposed to be that for the drones, that you would actually print out a page which has a kind of a code to say this is where you're supposed to leave my package. I nearly said present again. And the thing would land on the bit of paper and just say, oh yeah, there it is. There you go. You can take it out and off you go. But yeah, so this technology will change a lot of things. It's constantly changing, but we haven't ever really ended up in a position where people have magically become redundant as in overall need. You may have to upskill, you may have to cross skill, you may have to reskill, but there is always, all the experience so far is that there's always something. And